Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Brandon was in the living room that Friday night, feet propped up on the coffee table, a cold beer in his hand. Sophie had left a few hours earlier, excited about the idea of going to the stadium to watch the game with her work friends. He'd stayed home, enjoying the rare moment of quiet to relax. Their wedding anniversary would be coming up in a few months, 7 years, and Brandon felt satisfied with the life they'd built together. Sophie worked in the administrative department of a logistics company. He was a supervisor at an auto parts factory. Nothing extraordinary, but they were happy. Or at least, that's what Brandon believed. The game was thrilling. The home team was down 1-0 when, in the 38th minute of the second half, their striker finally equalized. The stadium erupted. The TV camera swept across the ecstatic crowd, capturing painted faces, waving flags, people jumping and shouting. That's when Brandon saw it. Just for 3 or 4 seconds, but it was enough for his world to start crumbling. Right there, on the 42-inch screen in front of him, was Sophie. She was perched on someone's shoulders, arms raised in celebration, her face radiant with joy. And the man holding her by the legs, beaming with the same wide smile, was Connor. His cousin Connor. Brandon blinked several times, as if he could wipe that image from his retina. Maybe it was someone who just looked like him. Maybe the camera had moved too quickly and he was imagining things. But no. It was her. The blue blouse Sophie had put on before leaving, her brown hair tied in a high ponytail, even the gold earring he'd given her for her birthday. And Connor, unmistakable in that red cap he always wore, his scruffy beard, that big grin. They weren't just standing close. There was something in the way they touched, in the intimacy of that embrace, that crossed any line of casualness or mere friendship. And more importantly, there wasn't a single work friend around. No familiar women at all. Just Connor and Sophie, lost in their own bubble of celebration. Brandon's heart raced. He sat up straight on the couch, eyes fixed on the TV, but the camera had already shifted its angle, now focused on the players running back to midfield. He grabbed the remote with trembling hands and tried to rewind the live broadcast, but the feature wasn't available on that channel. He needed to be sure. He picked up his phone and went straight to social media. Nothing. Sophie hadn't posted anything yet. Neither had Connor. But Brandon knew what he'd seen. And the more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place in a painfully clear way. Connor had been over to their house a few times in recent months. Always with some excuse like, just dropping by to say hi, or, I was passing through the neighborhood. Brandon had never suspected a thing because Connor was family. They'd grown up together, had been close since childhood. Connor had even been his best man at the wedding. Sophie had always been polite and friendly around him, but Brandon had never imagined there could be anything more than that. Now, going back through his memories, he recalled small details that had seemed insignificant at the time, the way Sophie always put a little extra effort into her appearance when she knew Connor was coming, the overly loud laughter during their conversations, how she always offered to make coffee or a snack whenever he was around. Brandon glanced at the clock. It was 8:40 p.m. The game hadn't ended yet. He took a deep breath, trying to control the wave of anger and nausea rising in his chest. He needed to talk to her. He needed to hear her voice, see how she'd react. He dialed Sophie's number. The phone rang once, twice. On the other end, he could hear the deafening roar of the crowd, shouts, chants. Sophie answered, breathless. Hey, honey, what's up? Everything okay? Her voice was cheerful, almost innocent. Brandon clenched his jaw. I just saw you on TV. There was a brief pause. Really? That's awesome. Did we show up on screen? You were on Connor's shoulders, Brandon said, each word coming out slowly, controlled. All cozy with him, hugging and celebrating. And I didn't see a single work friend around you, Sophie. Not one. The silence on the other end was devastating. Brandon could hear her breathing turn uneven, the background noise suddenly seeming distant. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. He wanted her to say something, anything. An explanation. An excuse. Even a well-crafted lie would have been better than that silence, which confirmed everything. Then, she simply hung up. Brandon stared at his phone screen, incredulous. She'd hung up. Just like that, hung up on him. He immediately tried calling again. Straight to voicemail. He tried once more. Voicemail again. Sophie had either turned off her phone or switched it to airplane mode. Brandon tossed the phone onto the couch and ran his hands over his face. He knew. In that moment, he knew. Guilt doesn't hang up the phone. Innocence doesn't run away. Only someone caught red-handed acts with that kind of desperation. The hours that followed were the worst of Brandon's life. He couldn't sit still. He paced the living room, sat down, stood back up, went to the kitchen, returned. He turned the TV back on but couldn't focus on anything. He picked up his phone dozens of times, staring at the screen as if a message from Sophie might magically appear with a reasonable explanation. But nothing. Absolute silence. He thought about calling Connor, but decided not to give him the chance to coordinate a story with Sophie. Better to wait. Better to let her come home and face what she'd done. Around 11:30 p.m., Brandon heard her car pull into the garage. Each second dragged as he waited. The sound of the key turning in the lock. The door opening slowly. And then Sophie walked in. She didn't look at him right away. She carefully closed the door, took her bag off her shoulder, and set it on the hallway console. When she finally turned toward the living room, Brandon could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were puffy and red, her makeup smudged. They stared at each other for long seconds. Brandon was seated on the couch, in the same spot as hours before, but now there was no beer in his hand. No relaxation. Just a dull, growing pain in his chest. Sophie took a few steps into the room, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Brandon, I'm sorry. I ruined everything." He didn't respond. Just kept looking at her, waiting. He needed to hear it. Needed her to say it out loud. Sophie sat down in the armchair across from him, unable to hold his gaze. "Connor and this started 3 months ago. I didn't plan it, Brandon. I swear to God I didn't plan for this to happen." She started crying, her hands covering her face. "He came over that time in September, remember? You'd gone out to buy stuff for the barbecue and I was alone with him. We started talking and I don't know how to explain it. It was like suddenly I saw him differently. And he said he'd always thought I was special, even before I married you, but never did anything because you're his cousin." Brandon felt a wave of nausea. "Are you telling me my cousin, the guy who was my best man at our wedding, had his eye on you this whole time?" "It's not like that," Sophie tried to defend herself, but her words came out jumbled through sobs. "It was a moment of weakness. On my part too. I should have shut it down before it turned into what it became, but I couldn't. Every time he came over, every text, every meeting. I knew it was wrong, but it was like I couldn't stop myself." "Meetings?" Brandon repeated, his voice sharp. "How many meetings, Sophie?" She hesitated, wiping away tears with the backs of her hands. "A few. We went to the movies once. We had lunch together when I told you I was going out with the girls from work. And we'd gone to 2 other games before tonight's. Today I said I was going with my friends because I knew you'd want to watch the game on TV and wouldn't come along." Brandon stood up abruptly, the sudden movement making Sophie shrink back in the chair. He paced the room, hands on his head, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an impulsive kiss at a party. It had been months, months of lies, planned meetings, deliberate betrayal. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes burning. You looked me in the eyes every single day. Slept next to me every night. Told me you loved me. And all this time you were sneaking around with my cousin behind my back. I love you, Sophie said desperately, standing up too. Brandon, I love you. I know you don't believe me right now, but it's true. What I feel for you is real. What happened with Connor it was a mess. It was wrong. I know it was wrong. Brandon let out a laugh, but there was no humor in it, only pure bitterness. A mess. 3 months is a mess to you? Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but then something shifted in her expression. She seemed to make a decision, as if about to jump off a cliff. There's something else I need to tell you. Brandon's heart stopped for a second. He didn't think the night could get any worse, but from the look on Sophie's face, he realized he was wrong. I'm pregnant, she said, her voice trembling. I took the test last week. I'm 2 months along. The world around Brandon seemed to slow down. He heard the words, but it took a few seconds for them to truly sink in. Pregnant. Sophie was pregnant. He should have been happy. They'd talked about having kids, it was something they both wanted. But then the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. And you don't know whose it is, Brandon said, not as a question, but as a terrible confirmation. Sophie completely broke down. She dropped to her knees on the floor, sobbing in a way Brandon had never seen before. I don't know. It could be yours. It could be his. Brandon, I don't know. We still, you and I still, during these past 2 months, so it could be yours. It could be. Brandon's legs went weak. He returned to the couch and sat down heavily, head lowered, hands clasped. Part of him wanted to scream, break things, throw Sophie out right then and there. Another part of him was so shocked he could barely process his own thoughts. A baby. Who could be his? Or his cousin's? The situation was so absurd, so grotesque, it felt unreal. Get out of here, he finally said, his voice low but firm. Go to the guest room or wherever you want, but get out of my sight now. Sophie tried to step closer, but he raised his hand, stopping her. I said go, Sophie. She grabbed her bag from the console and walked upstairs, each step echoing in the silent house. Brandon remained alone in the living room, his mind a whirlwind of anger, pain, and disbelief. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do. By dawn, he'd made a decision. Saturday morning, Brandon called Connor. His cousin answered with a cheerful voice, as if nothing had happened. Hey, cousin. What's up? I need to talk to you. Now. Come over to my house, Brandon said, and hung up before Connor could respond. Connor arrived half an hour later, still wearing the relaxed expression of someone who hadn't expected trouble. But as soon as he walked into the living room and saw Brandon's face, he understood. The color drained from his face. I saw you two on TV last night, Brandon began, arms crossed. You holding my wife on your shoulders, all cozy and cuddly. So I'm gonna give you one chance to man up and tell me the truth. What's going on between you and Sophie? Connor swallowed hard. For a moment, it looked like he might deny it, but then his shoulders slumped. Brandon, Manitoba, I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen. We just connected Anne. 3 months, Brandon cut him off. Sophie told me everything last night. For 3 months, you've both been lying to me. You came into my house, sat at my table, ate the food I paid for, and the whole time you had your eye on my wife. Worse, You were getting involved with her. Connor took a step back, as if he'd been slapped. It wasn't like that. I didn't plan this. It just happened naturally. Naturally? Brandon repeated, his voice rising. You think betraying your cousin is something that just happens naturally? You were my best man at my wedding, Connor. You were there the day I promised to take care of her, to protect her. And you were there too, promising to be my friend, my brother. And now you're telling me it just happened? Connor tried to speak, but Brandon didn't give him space. She's pregnant. Sophie's 2 months pregnant. And she doesn't know if the baby is mine or yours. The shock on Connor's face was genuine. He went pale, mouth hanging open. She's pregnant? And you're going to do a DNA test with me as soon as it's possible, Brandon continued. Because I'm not raising another man's child, especially not yours, after what you two did to me. Connor shook his head, dazed. Brandon, I didn't know. She never told me anything about this. Of course she didn't, Brandon said with contempt. Because she knew that would end your little game. Now there are real consequences. Now it's not just fun and betrayal, there's a baby involved. Connor tried to step closer, reaching out as if to touch Brandon's shoulder, but he pulled back. Don't touch me. Stay away from me. I want you out of my house right now. And don't come back. Ever. Connor opened his mouth to say something, but then just turned and left, closing the door behind him. Brandon stood there, chest heaving with heavy breaths. Some of the anger had left, but the pain remained, sharp and persistent. In the weeks that followed, Brandon moved like an automaton. He hired a lawyer and filed for divorce. Sophie tried to talk to him several times, begging for a second chance, saying she'd choose him if he'd let her. But Brandon couldn't even look at her. Every time he saw her face, he saw Connor too, saw the betrayal, the lies. Sophie moved in temporarily with a friend, and the house became empty and silent. The DNA test could only be safely done after several weeks of pregnancy. They were the longest days of Brandon's life. He swung between hoping the baby was his, because at least then something good might come from this tragedy, and wishing it wasn't, so he could cut all ties with Sophie without guilt. When the results finally arrived, Brandon was at his lawyer's office. He opened the envelope with trembling hands. The words seemed to dance before his eyes as he searched for the conclusion. And there it was, a 99.9% probability that Connor was the father. The baby was Connor's. Brandon felt a bitter relief. On one hand, he was free. He wouldn't have to deal with the complication of raising a child with a woman who'd betrayed him. On the other, there was something deeply sad about knowing that this baby, someone who could have been his, who could have been the start of a family, was the product of betrayal. He handed the envelope to his lawyer and simply said, "Move forward with the divorce. I want this finalized as soon as possible." Sophie got the news and tried calling Brandon, but he didn't answer. She sent messages saying she needed to talk, that she wanted to explain, but he blocked her number. There was nothing left to say. Connor, upon learning he was the father, tried to step up. He called Sophie and said they should try to make it work, for the baby's sake. But the truth was their relationship had been built on lies and betrayal, with no solid foundation. They tried for a few weeks, but the arguments were constant. Sophie demanded more commitment from Connor. Connor felt trapped in a situation he never truly wanted. Brandon's family was divided. Some stood firmly by his side, especially once they learned about the pregnancy and Connor's paternity. Others tried to downplay it, saying, "These things happen," or, "Family is family." Brandon cut ties with anyone who didn't support him. He had no patience left for peacemakers or people who turned a blind eye to what had happened. Connor was all but excluded from family gatherings. His mother, Brandon's aunt, tried to mediate, but even she acknowledged her son had crossed an unacceptable line. The divorce was finalized in 4 months. Sophie didn't contest the terms. She took the furniture that had been hers before the marriage and some personal belongings. The house stayed with Brandon, along with most of the assets they'd accumulated together. There was no alimony, no complicated division. Sophie just wanted out of it as quickly as possible, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of shame. 6 months after that fateful night in front of the TV, Brandon was in a different place. He'd sold the house, unable to keep living in a space filled with tainted memories. He bought a smaller apartment in another neighborhood and started over. He still felt the pain sometimes, especially at night when he was alone. But the anger had faded. In its place was a kind of melancholic resignation. He'd loved Sophie. He'd trusted her completely. And that trust had been shattered in the worst possible way, by 2 people who should have been the last to hurt him. One Saturday, Brandon was at a cafe when he saw Sophie across the street. She was visibly pregnant now, her belly prominent under a light dress. She was alone, carrying baby shopping bags. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something in her face, a deep sadness, maybe regret. Brandon looked away and kept walking. There was nothing left for him there. No anger, no desire for revenge, but also no compassion or longing. Just indifference. He later heard through a mutual friend that Connor and Sophie had broken up for good. She was raising the baby on her own, living in a small apartment on the other side of town. Connor paid child support but didn't want emotional involvement. He carried the weight of the choice he'd made too, shunned by family, avoided at social events. The thrill and excitement of their secret affair had turned into responsibilities and judgments neither was prepared to face. Brandon, meanwhile, was rebuilding. He started going out more with friends, picked up hobbies he'd abandoned, and even began to consider the idea of eventually meeting someone new. He wasn't in a hurry. The wound was still there, healing slowly. But he was alive. He was moving forward. And unlike Sophie and Connor, who'd be permanently linked through that child and would always carry the burden of their betrayal, Brandon was free. Free to start over. Free to trust again when he was ready. And free from the burden of having built his happiness on someone else's deceit. Sometimes, late at night, he still thought about that game broadcast. Those few seconds that changed everything. And he wondered what his life would have been like if he hadn't turned on the TV that day, if he hadn't seen that scene. Would he have found out another way? Would he have kept being deceived? But then he'd shake his head and push those thoughts away. There was no point living in what-ifs. The truth had come out, painful and brutal, but necessary. And now he had the chance to write a new chapter, this time with someone who valued trust as much as he did. Someone who understood that love isn't built on lies and betrayal. Someone who deserved to be by his side. And Brandon knew that when he found that person, he'd be ready. Because he'd survived the worst. And when you survive the worst, everything that comes after feels just a little easier to face. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.